It's just a little help. You're selfish, my dad shouted when I refused to pay for sister's car. I walked away for good. 3 days later, I received a call from the bank. I was 26 when everything finally broke beyond repair. The cracks had been there my whole life, hairline fractures spreading through the foundation of our relationships, growing wider with each passing year. That night was my mother's birthday dinner. We gathered around her dining table, the same one we'd sat at for countless Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. My father, stern-faced as ever. My golden child sister, Brenda, basked in his approving gaze. And me, the family disappointment, despite my stable job and self-sufficient life. The evening progressed as these family gatherings always did. Then Brenda dropped her bomb. "I'm thinking of getting a new car," she said, twirling pasta around her fork. "Something cute, maybe a convertible." My father nodded approvingly. "You deserve it, princess." I took a sip of wine, trying to swallow my irritation along with the Cabernet. Brenda was 23, worked part-time at a boutique, and lived in an apartment I was already paying half the rent for, a fact my parents conveniently forgot whenever money came up. My father turned to me, his expression expectant. "What do you think, son? You could help your sister out with this, right?" My hand froze midair, wine glass suspended between table and lips. The audacity. I carefully set my glass down. "I already pay half her rent," I said quietly. "I think that's enough." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "What's that supposed to mean?" my father demanded, his voice taking on that dangerous edge I knew too well. "It means exactly what I said. I already support Brenda financially. I'm not buying her a car." Brenda's face crumpled into a practiced pout. "I thought you were doing better at work. It's just a little help." My jaw tightened. A little help. Like the little help I'd been giving her for years. The little help that had prevented me from moving to a better apartment or taking that trip to Rome I'd been saving for. "I'm doing fine at work. That doesn't mean I'm obligated to buy you a car." My father's face darkened. "This is how you treat your sister after everything we've done for you." The familiar guilt trip. The vague reference to unnamed sacrifices. The implication that I was somehow forever indebted for being raised, something parents are supposed to do anyway. Something inside me snapped. "What exactly have you done for me, Dad? Tell me, because I paid for my own college, I bought my own car, I've been financially independent since I was 19. His eyes bulged. "You ungrateful." "No, I'm not ungrateful. I'm tired. Tired of being treated like the family ATM while you act like Brenda is too precious to support herself." "Because she is better than you," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "She always has been." The words hung in the air like smoke. My mother gasped. Brenda looked away, but I just felt relief. Finally, the truth I'd always known, spoken aloud. I laughed. I couldn't help it. "Well, if she's so much better than me, I guess she doesn't need my help anymore." I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "That means I won't be paying her rent next month, or ever again." My father stood too, pointing toward the door. "Get out of my house." "Gladly." I grabbed my jacket. "By the way, Dad, maybe you should check who's been covering Brenda's rent for the past 2 years before you kick out your personal bank." Brenda's eyes widened in panic. "What's that supposed to mean?" I paused at the doorway. "It means I'm done. You've been living in that apartment for 2 years. I've paid half your rent for 2 years. Dad hasn't contributed a dime despite what he told you." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. "But Dad said—" "Dad lied," I said simply, "and now you're on your own." That night marked the beginning of the end, or maybe it was the beginning of my freedom. Perspective is a funny thing. The fallout was swift and devastating. Brenda couldn't afford her rent without my help. She called me 17 times that first week, her messages evolving from angry demands to teary pleas. Dad refused to step in, despite his bold claims about family duty. His financial situation wasn't as solid as he'd led everyone to believe. I emptied the joint account I'd foolishly maintained with Brenda for emergencies. Emergencies that somehow always involved designer shoes or weekend getaways with friends. She'd treated it like her personal spending account while I dutifully deposited money every month. My father was livid. He threatened to sell my car, the one I'd bought myself at 19, paid off at 23. When I reminded him that the title was in my name, he went ballistic, called me untrustworthy, said I was tearing the family apart. I found out later he'd actually tried to sell it anyway, had listed it online and everything. When I went to my parents' house to retrieve it, the confrontation turned ugly. Neighbors peeked through curtains as my father shouted about family loyalty while I calmly loaded my belongings into the trunk. My mother stood on the porch, wringing her hands, begging us to stop making a scene. Always concerned with appearances, never with the truth. What I didn't realize then was that my father had already set a more elaborate trap. 3 days after I retrieved my car, I received an official-looking letter. My stomach dropped as I read it, a notice of repossession for my vehicle. It didn't make sense. I'd paid off the car years ago, had the title in my name. I called the bank listed on the notice. After being transferred multiple times, I finally spoke with someone who explained the situation. According to their records, my father had taken out a title loan against my car 6 months earlier. My blood ran cold. "That's impossible," I said. "I have the title, he couldn't have done that." "Sir, we have all the paperwork here," the representative said, "signed by you." But I hadn't signed anything. I demanded copies of the documents. When they arrived by email an hour later, I stared at them in disbelief. There was my signature, or what looked like my signature, on loan papers I'd never seen. My father had forged my name, used my social security number, created a perfect replica of my signature, likely copied from old-school documents he'd kept. I felt violated in a way I couldn't articulate. This wasn't just financial manipulation. This was identity theft. This was criminal. I spent the next 3 days in a fog of betrayal and rage. My father had been planning this for months, had been plotting to use my vehicle, my property, as collateral for his own financial gain, all while demanding I help support his favorite child. The bank was sympathetic but firm. Either I paid the $7,000 loan my father had taken out, or they would repossess the car. My options were limited: pay off a loan I never took out, file fraud charges against my own father, or lose my transportation. I chose a fourth option. I sold the car myself, paid off the fraudulent loan, and used the remaining money to buy a cheaper vehicle. It meant downgrading significantly, but it served one more tie to my father's control. When he discovered what I'd done, he called in a rage. How dare I sell that car? Didn't I know he needed that money? Didn't I understand what this would do to the family? I hung up without responding. His problems were no longer mine, but the worst betrayal was yet to come. 3 weeks after that disastrous dinner, I discovered my father had been systematically draining our family savings account, an account I'd been contributing to since my first job at 16. He'd been taking out loans against it, using the money to cover Brenda's shopping habits and his own faltering business ventures. My name was still on that account. I went to the bank the next morning and withdrew every remaining cent, all $7,853 of it. Not a fortune, but it was rightfully mine after what he'd taken. Then I closed the account. My phone rang that afternoon. My father's name flashed on the screen. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was equal parts rage and panic. "Taking what's mine before you steal the rest," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I needed that money," he shouted. "The collectors are coming next week." My heart raced, but not from fear, from clarity. This had never been about family. It had always been about using me. Not my problem anymore. "You can't do this to us. We're family." "Family doesn't steal from each other, Dad." I hung up, blocked his number, blocked Brenda's too, changed the locks on my apartment door. It wasn't enough. 2 days later, I came home to find my apartment door ajar. My television was gone. My laptop. The watch my grandfather had left me. My father had stolen my spare key from my mother's emergency contact list. I called the police, filed a report. They found my electronics at a pawn shop across town. The owner remembered my father clearly, had his signature on the receipt. I contacted a lawyer, recorded my father on the phone admitting to the theft, threatened to press charges unless he returned every dollar he'd ever taken from me. He paid, every cent, and I cut all ties. This decision to completely sever connections with my family wasn't made impulsively. It came after nights of packing my apartment, hands trembling, questioning everything I thought I knew about family and obligation. I'd been raised to believe that family bonds were unbreakable, sacred, that you forgave family no matter what because blood was thicker than water. My father had repeated these mantras my entire life, even as he systematically exploited and undermined me. The cognitive dissonance was suffocating. How could I abandon the people who had raised me? What kind of person walks away from their family completely? But then, what kind of father steals from his son? What kind of father forges signatures and drains bank accounts? What kind of father breaks into his child's home? The guilt of leaving fought with the fear of staying connected. I wrote pages of pros and cons, called an old therapist, talked it through with the two friends who knew the full situation. The turning point came one night at 3 a.m. I was lying awake, my stomach in knots, when a simple question formed in my mind. Would I allow anyone else to treat me this way? The answer was immediate and clear. No, never. So why was I allowing it from people who were supposed to love me more than anyone else? That clarity didn't make the decision easier. It just made it necessary. I moved to a new apartment, changed jobs, went completely off the grid as far as my family was concerned. Sometimes the only way to heal is to remove yourself from the source of the pain. The first few months of no contact were the hardest. Holidays left me hollow, birthdays passed unmarked. I'd reach for my phone to text Brenda about a movie she'd love or call my mom when I cooked one of her recipes. Then I'd remember they weren't part of my life anymore. I'd wonder if I'd made the right choice, if I was overreacting, if I should just apologize and try to mend things. Then I'd remember the theft, the lies, the years of manipulation, and I'd put the phone down. The doubt would creep in at night when the apartment felt too quiet and my thoughts too loud. Was I being cruel, selfish? What if they needed me? What if they were sorry? But deep down, I knew the pattern would only repeat. My father would manipulate, Brenda would take, my mother would enable, and I would be left drained and depleted, wondering why I was never enough. So I held firm. I built new traditions, found new people who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide. Slowly, the raw wound of separation began to heal into something resembling peace. 6 months later, Brenda emailed me. She was pregnant, the father had left, she needed help. "We're family," she wrote. "Family sticks together." I stared at those words for a long time, my finger hovering over the reply button. Part of me, the part conditioned by years of guilt and obligation, wanted to rush in and rescue her, to prove I was a good brother, a good person. But another part, the part I was learning to listen to, recognized the familiar pattern. The crisis, the appeal to family loyalty, the expectation that I would set aside my boundaries because she needed me. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I sat with the email open, examining my feelings. There was sadness for her situation, concern for the unborn child, a reflexive urge to fix things. But there was also a profound weariness, a recognition that this cycle would never end unless I ended it. I closed the email without responding. Later that night, after more reflection, I marked it as spam and moved on with my life. That was 3 years ago. My new apartment has a view of the city. I've been promoted twice at work. I travel when I want to. No one drains my bank accounts or makes me feel guilty for having boundaries. Sometimes healing looks like walking away. Sometimes it's not about fixing what's broken, but about accepting that some things weren't built properly in the first place. Last week I saw my mother at the grocery store. We made eye contact across the produce section. She looked older, tired. I felt a momentary pang of something, not quite guilt, not quite sadness, more like echoes of what might have been in a different family. She approached cautiously like I might bolt, maybe I would have once. "You look well," she said, her eyes taking in my appearance. I nodded. "I am well." She fidgeted with her purse strap. "Your father had a heart attack last month." My pulse quickened. Old conditioning dies hard. "Is he okay?" "He'll recover, but it was serious." I waited for the guilt trip, the manipulation, the expectation that I would come running back, checkbook in hand. It didn't come. Instead, she said, I've been doing some thinking about everything. I should have stepped in. I should have protected you. My throat tightened unexpectedly. This wasn't in the script. Yes, I agreed. You should have. Tears welled in her eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me or him. I just wanted you to know that I understand now why you left. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. 3 years of distance and her simple acknowledgement still had the power to move me. Brenda named her baby after you, she said softly, even after everything. I stared at the apples in my hand, suddenly very interested in their shiny red skin. She's still living with you? Yes, she's trying though, working full-time now, taking classes at night. I felt nothing but a distant pity. Good for her. My mother looked like she wanted to say more but stopped herself. Instead, she reached out, hesitated, then gently touched my arm. I'm proud of you, she whispered. I should have said that more. The words settled around me like fallen leaves, too late to change seasons but still somehow significant. Thank you, I said and meant it. We didn't exchange numbers, didn't make plans to reconnect. Some bridges once burned leave only ashes. But as I watched her walk away, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, exactly. I wasn't ready for that. Maybe I never would be, but understanding, perhaps. Recognition that we were all broken in our own ways, playing out patterns established long before we had any say in the matter. The truth is, going no contact wasn't a single decision made in a moment of anger. It was thousands of tiny choices made every day for years. The choice not to call when I was lonely, not to reach out during holidays, not to respond to the occasional messages that found their way to me through mutual acquaintances. Each choice was accompanied by its own grief, its own questioning, its own internal battle between what I'd been taught to value and what I needed to survive. I'd wonder during these moments if cutting them off completely had been too extreme, if there might have been some middle ground, careful distance rather than complete separation. But then I'd remember the violation of having my identity stolen, the betrayal of finding my apartment ransacked, the years of being valued only for what I could provide, never for who I was. And I'd know with a certainty that ran bone deep that no contact had been my only viable path to healing. My father had always called Brenda the golden child, but gold is soft, malleable. It bends under pressure. What he never understood was that pressure had turned me into something stronger, like carbon into diamond, forged in the fire of his disappointment. The most important family is the one you choose, the one you build, the one that sees your worth without demanding you prove it constantly. I found mine in unexpected places, in friends who show up without being asked, in colleagues who value my contributions, in my own company, which turns out to be better than I'd ever given it credit for. Some people say blood is thicker than water, but I've learned that self-respect is thicker than both. To anyone trapped in a family dynamic that drains rather than sustains you, there is life on the other side. It may not come with the neat resolution we're taught to expect. It may not include tearful reunions or dramatic forgiveness scenes. But it comes with peace, with quiet mornings where you don't wake up dreading phone calls, with holidays spent exactly as you choose, with the profound realization that your value was never determined by those who couldn't see it. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is to walk away and let the pieces fall where they may. There are days I still dream of reconciliation, of a family healed and whole, but dreams aren't the same as delusions. I know now that some wounds never fully close, and that's okay. Breaking free isn't just about distance. It's about deprogramming, unlearning the idea that saying no makes you selfish, that having boundaries makes you cruel, that choosing yourself makes you a bad person. It's the hardest work I've ever done, and it's ongoing. But for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm living on my own terms, not as the family disappointment, not as Brenda's supporting character, not as my father's ATM or my mother's peacemaker. Just as myself, whole and complete without needing anyone else's validation or approval. There's a strange grief in that too, mourning the family I never had and never will. The unconditional love I sought but never found in the places it should have been most abundant. But there's also profound freedom in choosing my path, in defining my worth, in recognizing that while I didn't choose the family I was born into, I can choose how their influence shapes my future. And I choose to break the cycle, to heal, to thrive, not despite them, but because I finally realized I deserve more than what they were willing to give.